sometimes by necessity, I need to start writing a message before I've actually preached the previous message, and that happened in this last week. I started writing this over 10 days ago because I knew that this particular week was going to be busy. I flew to Melbourne on Monday to attend the Jubilarians' anniversary mass and dinner for the priests of Corpus Christi College, my alma mater. And then on Tuesday, we celebrated the funeral of Mike Piccone. And then on Wednesday, I had meetings all morning and a meeting in the afternoon and then a meeting at night. And Thursday, I had mass in the morning as well as Huntingfield, and then 2 meetings in the afternoon as well as an appointment. And on Friday, I actually had a chance to sit down and do some more work on my homily. But as it so happens, I actually overplan, and so I always feel as if I am rushed. But during the week, I had some times when I was able to sit down and to simply reflect on what was going on around me. And one of those happened after the mass and dinner on Monday in Melbourne. I was able to join with some of the priests who celebrated 60 and 50 years of ordination. Sadly, there was only one from the 25-year group, but there were 3 of my companions, people that I spent 7 years in the seminary with, and we were able to sit at the one table and share some of the stories about our journey of priesthood and what's happened over the last couple of years. COVID, and last year we missed gathering, but we'd been able to gather most years previously. And then on Tuesday, we had a wonderful experience of people sharing the story of Mike Piccone's life. It was very busy, Hazel. And that's what happens when we hear the story of people's lives being shared with us. And that was a great celebration as well. And on Wednesday, I had time between one meeting and the next to sit and just think about what had happened in these days. And I stopped and thought about the priests who celebrated their jubilees, my classmates as we shared our story, the story of Mike and his life. And I began to see very clearly what I've been talking about in this message series, the question, where is God? And I came to realise once more that God isn't always in the big events. Sometimes the power and the presence of God is in the ordinary things of life and the ordinary experiences of our day. And having that opportunity to stop and to think about what that actually means is a great blessing. And it's something perhaps we don't all do very often. We might do it sometimes, but it's good to stop and think about what is actually happening in our lives at this moment. So over these few weeks, we've listened to the story of the prophet Elijah. He found God not in the earthquake or the fire or the great wind, but in a gentle breeze as he stopped at the face of the cave and was able to experience God in that moment. We heard it in the story of the Canaanite woman who came to Jesus and pleaded to have her daughter healed. And after Jesus had rejected her, she was able to challenge him to think about what his ministry was about. Was it just for the people of Israel, which is what Jesus had said? I've come not for the Gentiles, but for the lost sheep of Israel. And she had said, but the dogs under the table get the scraps. And Jesus looked at her and said, your faith has saved her. Your daughter is healed. Sometimes it's in the challenges, but other times it's in the simple. And then we had the 2 weeks where we heard the story of Peter. The first week, Peter was able to say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Able to recognize in Jesus that this was something very special and he was the one who was to come. But as soon as Jesus spoke about the challenge of the cross, of the fact that he was to suffer and to die and to rise again, Peter remonstrated and said, that can't happen to you, Lord. And like so many of us, when something is working, we can see the presence of God. But when something challenges us, we wonder where God is. And Peter was told, get behind me, Satan, for what the way you think is not God's way, but man's. And yet, in the previous passage, Jesus had said to him, blessed are you, Peter, because the way you think is not man's way, but God's. So we have this dilemma going between the capacity to experience God really and the challenges we have to what is happening in our lives. We know that there are lots of things that make that really different. So one of the things that happens in our readings this weekend is that we have, again, the story of one of the great prophets. Ezekiel is there as a prophet of the message of God's love. And yet Ezekiel is being told that what he is called to do is something quite profound. He's told he's going to be appointed as a sentry to the house of Israel. And he's told, when you hear a word from my mouth, warn them in my name. So he's being told you're going to have a real challenge about making my message known. And then he is reminded that this is going to be really challenging, because he is then told, if I say to a wicked man, wicked wretch, you are to die, and you do not speak to warn the wicked man to renounce his ways, then he shall die for his sin. But I will hold you responsible. So suddenly the prophet is not just telling the people that they must change their lives, but he's being given an imperative. He is told that he must speak into the midst of what's going on. And he must challenge people to think about and to change their lives. And if he doesn't, he will suffer as well. And so we know that that was one of the challenges that all of the prophets faced. The message that they were to proclaim was going to be a message that was uncomfortable to the people. And most of us, and I put myself in this spot really closely because I find it difficult to challenge people when something is wrong. And yet Jesus is telling us, you must do it. You must speak in to the issues and challenges that are there. If you don't, you have failed. But then Ezekiel is told that if he does speak to the word, and even if the person doesn't listen, but if he speaks the word, then his life will be saved. So the prophet is being told, we are being told, that there are things that we might need to speak into, to speak about, that are in fact challenging. And that comes through again in our gospel reading today, where Jesus tells us that where there is a problem in the community, you must speak first of all to the person where the problem exists. And if the person doesn't listen to you, then he tells us something, and this is really important. He tells us that we must become part of a community. He said where two or three gather, then we need to be together to deal with an issue. It's not just me against somebody, but it must be the community walking with and working towards helping somebody make a correction to their life. That doesn't mean ganging up on them. Because always, as Paul tells us in our second reading, what we are to do is to be under the command of love. And Paul is quite emphatic when he says, avoid getting into debt except the debt of love. And then he goes on to finish by saying, all of the commandments are summed up in the single command. You must love your neighbour as yourself. Now we hear that quite often, that commandment was to love God and love your neighbour as yourself. But there's a dimension that we don't always add to those words. And that's the final few words that tells us, as I have loved you. So if we are to love God and love our neighbour, then we must do it with the way in which Jesus loved us. And that was to freely and completely give himself to us, so that we might be an expression by the way we live of how God loves us. I frequently use in funeral liturgies in my homily a line from the musical Les Miserables, a line that says, to love another person is to see the face of God. At the time, I'm trying to say to people that in the midst of their sadness, in the midst of their loss, the fact that they're there supporting the family is in fact an expression of God's love. the fact that they are witnessing to love by their support and their prayer. It may not be the best answer to the question, where is God at that moment? Because that's obviously a moment when many people are wondering, how does God work in a time of sadness and loss? But if one person stops to think that maybe when we live and really love someone, then we are God present in the midst of the world, then maybe something has changed and something has shifted in the heart of a person. And that's obviously what Jesus is calling us to talk about. He's calling us to challenge people to have a change of heart. That word we call metanoia, a turning away from where we were and facing in a new direction. We need constantly to be reminded of that, and that's where Paul tells us that the command to love God and to love your neighbour is the first and the most important. It's what Jesus said in the gospel as well. But at the end of today's gospel reading, there's another passage which I think is significant. It tells us that where 2 or 3 gather in my name, anything you ask at all, it will be granted to you by my Father in heaven. Mel Garvin, who founded the movement which just slipped my mind as I opened my mouth. Mel Garvin would speak about evangelization, and he would say where 2 or 3 people gather, they can change 100. So we could change close to 1,000 people if each one of us went out believing that what we could do, we could make a difference. If 2 or 3 gather in my name and ask anything, then my Father in heaven will grant it to you. So what can we do today to make a difference? What can we do today to make God's love real for others? The gospel is about taking our prayer and making it real. If people are going to find an answer to the question, where is God? They're going to find it in the example and the witness of the Christian community that shares what God's love really means to them. They're not going to find it necessarily in a book. They're not going to find it in a video. They're going to find it in our words and our examples, which will then lead them to further understanding. But the first step is going to happen because you and I dare to live generously and graciously towards others as God lives towards us.